record on this computer. So I don't really know what your background is in English language. I don't know how you classify yourself in terms of whether you think you're like an advanced speaker or like a beginner or intermediate. So probably in this week's Canvas exercise, I'll ask you to maybe like let me know more or less where you're at in terms of your knowledge of English, whether you feel like you're competent or, you know, what level of competence you're at. Anyway, so let me see. I'm going to check one last time to see if there's anybody else. No, we'll leave this open. All right, so I'm just going to jump straight to, oh, wait, somebody. Okay, so this is a grammar class. What does that mean? Well, that means that we're going to be studying and looking at the structure of the English language from perhaps a perspective that you've never thought of before. So maybe when you think about grammar and what it entails, you maybe think about a person who's correcting somebody else's work and paying a lot of attention to detail and saying this is correct, wrong, a comma doesn't go here, whatever, right? And yes, grammar is about knowing, you know, when to use these conventions and when to not use these conventions, but it's so much more than that, okay? It's basically the systematicities and the rules behind English that make it comprehensible. You know, having these rules and having these consistencies and these regularities in the way that language works helps us understand one another, okay? But like anything in our human experience, you know, grammar is not static. There is no absolute one way of saying something. There are many ways of saying the same thing, okay? And not only that, but grammar can actually change through time. It can evolve. So let's say that new technology is being developed, like computers and, you know, iPhones and all these things. So they have really revolutionized the way that we speak and how we use, you know, grammar and languages, right? So language evolves as humans evolve. So it's never the same, okay? So yeah, so hopefully throughout this class, you'll be able to think about grammar in a way that you maybe didn't think about it before. All right, so our first theme for this week is how do we define what grammar is? So it's all about basic introductory definitions that will hopefully help you understand this class. Okay, what is grammar? I thought I had like an introduction here of me, but that's okay. I'll just introduce myself very briefly, or let me see if I have the introductory slide. I don't have an introductory slide. That's weird. All right, so my name is Dr. Katherine Morales. I am a PhD in linguistics. I'm 31 years old, so I look a bit young, but I'm a doctor. I did my studies in Europe, in Scotland and in Ireland. And I've been studying English since, you know, for many years now. So I specialize in linguistics. Specifically, I look at language in society. So I'm interested in looking at, somebody says that you can't hear me. Can you, in the chat, can you write if you can't hear me? How many of you cannot hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, so I'll continue and hopefully the video, you'll be able to hear me. All right, so yeah, so I look at language in society. That means that I like listening to what people are saying and how they're saying it. So attention paid to speech and all that stuff. So native to Mayagüez. I don't know. I don't think you need to know anything else about me, but nice to meet you. All right, so an outline for today. So today we will be talking about English grammar, speakers of English, dialects of English, standard English. What is grammar? What are different standard Englishes? What are non-standard Englishes, and formal and informal styles? So first of all, let's dive into, the unique, universal question about language. Why do we have language? Why do people talk? What is language for? So undoubtedly, language is a complex, complicated form of communication. Yes, we can talk about grammar and rules, right? But it's so much more complicated than that and convoluted, and there are a lot of contradictories and different ways of saying the same thing. So it's very complex. So why do people talk? Why do people talk? Well, probably the logical answer that you would have for this is to communicate with one another, right? To understand each other, to have this kind of information exchange. So people talk in order to communicate information, right? What kind of information? Well, maybe in your previous English language classes, you would say, oh, to express your feelings, how you're feeling, or, language is like a form of art and expression. And yes, this is part of the reason why we have language. We communicate emotions. We also communicate opinions. So, if you agree with something, disagree, and your values. So you communicate something about yourself and who you are to other people, right? You also ask, so you request. You describe everyday events like in the news or things that are happening right now, right? You also use language to communicate about not so obvious things, such as, abstract concepts like love, happiness, these emotions or states of being like manliness, right? So things that are not, are a bit complicated to define. So we use language for all sorts of things. And perhaps this last bullet point that I have, to communicate in the abstract, is one of the things that differentiates human language from animal communication. Because, we know that animals communicate for food, if they want to send off a warning, for mating purposes, right? But humans, we talk about philosophy, we talk about politics, we talk about a lot of things that are not just our emotions and things that happen every day, right? So in short, language is a fundamental part of you, your identity, and your way of thinking. And communication is an important part of our human experience, okay? And grammar facilitates this from happening, this information exchange, this communicative human experience. So what does it mean to know a language? When we talk about a language, how do we know that I know English or I know Spanish, right? So what does it mean to know it? Maybe your immediate response, if I ask you, do you know English, or what defines a good English speaker, you would say, knowing how to speak the language fluently. So there's a lot of emphasis on spoken language, spoken production. Maybe as an afterthought, or maybe you wouldn't say this, maybe you'd also say being able to understand what is being said. So it's not just you producing, but you listening and understanding and making sense of what somebody else is telling you. Being able to read in that language and understand that language. This competence or this knowledge of language is literacy. Okay, it's called literacy. And this definition of language is a little bit more complicated because even though, for English and Spanish, we can talk about a documented existence of our language. We have grammar books, we have dictionaries, we have novels written in Spanish and English. So we have an alphabet system, so we can talk about writing in that language. Not all of the world's languages have a writing system. They don't all have alphabets or have a permanent existence in a textbook. Okay, so this definition of what it means to know a language depends on the language that we're talking about. So knowing how to write in that language well. Okay, so if you know how to read in that language well, you also know how to write in that language well. That's also production, but again, it depends on whether the language that we're talking about has a writing system, has an alphabet. The truth is, while we may have general ideas of what makes a person a native speaker of a language, or somebody who's fluent in a language has this intuition, we may experience more difficulty in terms of describing the technicalities of what it means to know a language itself. We could say that yes, it means that you know how to speak it, hear it, write it, read it, but all of these definitions are still very superficial. Knowledge of a language can vary from person to person. It can vary according to your level of education or the type of education you've received. It can vary according to your socioeconomic background and the opportunities that you've had in life and the different linguistic exposures that you've received, from the moment you were born, from your parents, immediate surroundings, to when you went to school, etc., and your interests, and all of these different things about our everyday lives that shape our knowledge of our first language and our knowledge of our second language, okay? And oftentimes, especially if we're talking about our first language, our mother tongue language, typically because we've had it for such a long time since birth, sometimes what happens is that there's a lot of rules of our first language that we know, but that we can't explain to somebody else. So if somebody asks us, how do you say this in Spanish? Supongamos que Spanish is your first language. How do you say something in Spanish? You tell them, this is how you say it in Spanish. And then they ask you why, and maybe you'll be able to say, I don't know. It's just the way that it's said. I don't really know the grammatical rule behind why it's said that way. I just know, right? And the reason why you know is because since you were born and brought up, you've had all these different experiences that have cemented themselves in your brain, right? All of these different rules. So describing language as a system, which by the way is a good definition for what grammar is, language as a system, with meaningful components that shape our everyday lives is what grammar is. But, we may not be able to talk about grammar in such a specific way to somebody. So you could just say, it's just right, it's just the way we say it, but I don't know why. By the way, these slides will also be made available through Canvas. So if I'm going too fast, not to worry. So knowing a language and the concept of a native speaker is also often brought up when we talk about grammar, la gramática, a native speaker. What is a native speaker? A native speaker is nativo, right? Somebody who speaks a language as the first language. And why is there so much emphasis on a native speaker? Because there's a lot of evidence that shows that, the person that feels most competent in a language tends to know it from birth. But it doesn't mean that someone who knows it as a second language won't reach that level of competence, okay? So when you're a native speaker of a language, you use that language so instinctively that it is difficult for you sometimes to stand outside yourself as an observer and think of it as something independent from you. So like Spanish is something that exists outside of you, you know, and it's something that it is known and can be learned by others. So sometimes this kind of mind frame is difficult for us to grasp. So a native speaker is a keyword, it's a terminology. A native speaker of a language usually has a sense of confidence in thinking that they know all they need to know about their own language. It's like, I just know, I know everything there is to know about Spanish. There could be words that I don't know what they mean, right? But in terms of structure and reading and speaking, I feel pretty confident. So they have what is known as an intuition or native speaker intuition. So a native speaker may be able to tell you the structure of a sentence, but not exactly why a sentence is incorrect. Like we said, I just know it's correct. I don't know why, what are the rules, but I just know. So now let's see if you have that sort of intuition about English. So which one of these sentences is correct? Which one is incorrect? Why? So first sentence, Brian believes himself to be a genius. Seems okay. Brian believes he is a genius. Seems okay. Brian believes he to be a genius. Brian believes himself is a genius. So if you took in these different sentences that kind of mimic the same beginning, the same construction, Brian believes, there's some people in the chat. The second one is correct. So first one is correct. Lorraine, the second one is correct. Third one is incorrect. Fourth one is also incorrect. Okay, so why is the third and the fourth one incorrect? You may be sleeping, that's okay. So the third one and the fourth one are incorrect. I don't know, I just know they're incorrect. Brian believes he to be a genius. The problem here is, okay, it isn't the grammatical order. Lionel, it is not written correctly. Okay, so the problem here lies in he to be, okay? So like if we're talking about Brian believes, we don't need that he there, okay? Actually, yeah, that he is okay, that he could be there. So like if we're talking Brian believes, the problem is in to be, okay? So to be is another way of saying is, okay? Something that is something that is are. It's something that is be. Something that is something that exists, okay? So to be is the infinitive form of is, okay? So the same way that, you know, to walk is the infinitive form of walk, to be is infinitive of is. So the problem here is in to be, in the verb. Brian believes himself is a genius. Here is when, you know, this is a little bit redundant, okay? So if we're talking about Brian and the action of believes, well, we already know that he believes something. We don't need this reflexive pronoun, okay? So here, the choice of the pronoun is incorrect. And here, it's the choice of the verb, all right? So that's why these are incorrect. If you don't know the names for these, to be and himself, that's okay because we're only just starting. So you're not expected to know what this is, that to be is, or that himself is a pronoun. So why do we have a standard form of any language? And what is the standard anyway? So when we talk about a standard grammar, we're talking about a material. You can say Brian believes himself a genius. No, you can't. I mean, yes, if you take out the is, Brian believes himself a genius, but sounds a little bit archaic. Brian believes. There are, for US standard English, we don't really use reflexive pronouns that much, especially if they are redundant. But especially if they're redundant in US English grammar. But in Ireland, for instance, in Irish English, they use a lot of reflexive pronouns. So it depends. But for our particular purposes, in this example, it's incorrect. But Brian believes himself a genius. I think that could be correct. Okay. That could be okay, that alternative. So why do we have a standard form of any language? So when we talk about standard, we're talking about something that's codified, something that's materialized, el estándar, right? So the same way that our Department of Education has standards for their curriculum, rules of what to follow, what to teach according to what grade, grammar has a standard or has standards or a set of rules. These sets of rules are social constructs. They have been put in place by people, by mankind. It doesn't mean that they're, a fact of life. Okay? And who decides what the standard form of any language is? Typically, people in positions of power, people who run these academic educational institutions, the people behind the printing press, the people behind technology, all of these different things that have become widespread and have therefore spread ways of speaking and ways of symbolizing language far and beyond. Okay, so the standard form of any language, whenever we say that, we're typically talking about a codified language. Codified meaning that someone has sat down to write it as a set of rules. But not all languages of the world are codified or have standard forms, okay? So we said the purpose of language is to communicate. In order to be able to successfully express ideas, an economic and rule-based system such that people from different parts of the world can understand it could be practical. And especially if we're talking about a language such as English that has been adopted in different parts of the world for all kinds of purposes. So for science, for education, for the entertainment industry, for tourism, international communication, you name it, English has been adopted by many people around the world. So it is useful that we have rules. It's useful that we have, a code as to how to speak it. Why? Because it's not necessarily that the native speaker needs it. The person who speaks it as a first language, they don't need to know the rules. They are brought up with that language in their immediate environment. But the standard form of a language really helps people that are learning that language as a second language, foreigners. Okay, so it helps a lot in that case. So it is important to have a universal, mutually intelligible form of English for international communicative purposes. Okay? But it doesn't mean, and I make an emphasis here, that standard English is the only correct way of speaking English. Okay? That's really important. There are many different world Englishes. There's different groups of people in the United States that use English differently. You know, different to what we see in dictionaries and in language books. But just because we don't see it in the books that are made by the powerful and the highly educated doesn't mean that they're not a form of communication in it of itself. And it doesn't mean that those ways of speaking English do not have grammar. Otherwise, if other Englishes don't have grammar, how do people understand one another, right? So every way of speaking has rules. Every single way of speaking has rules, whether you have an alphabet or whether you have dictionaries or not, okay? So they have trends, they have ways of saying things. It just so happens that for our part of the world and our culture and our language, you know, we have these institutions that promote a standard. Like for Spanish, La Real Academia Española, right? They're always issuing things about Spanish. For English, we have Oxford English Dictionaries, Merriam-Webster, and all these other people. Anyway, so I have a question. So it's like Spanish. Spanish and PR are different. Yes, exactly. So like Spanish from Puerto Rico is different from peninsular Spanish, but it doesn't mean that, you know, it's incorrect. It doesn't mean that we don't have grammar, right? It doesn't mean that Spanish from Spain is superior. It's not. It's just that they were there first, right? I mean, they're the ones setting up these institutions. So it's mainly, you know, when we think about grammar books, we need to really challenge what we read and not just take what we're reading as a given. Sometimes, especially when we talk about grammar, there is a tendency for people to talk about grammar in absolutes, right? So like if you said something wrong or whatever, people will pick up a dictionary and say, you're wrong, right? And people then engage in debates and really personal debates of why you're saying it wrong or how it should be said. And there's all these different opinions of language. But the reality is that language is actually very diverse and language changes over time. And language evolves as humans evolve, as technology evolves. And it's not always the same. And we, you know, not just on a level of Puerto Rico versus Spain, but, you know, let's say the Spanish spoken in Área Metro could be different from the Spanish spoken in Mayagüez. We can also talk about neighborhood differences. We can also talk about the rural versus urban distinction. So people in the countryside speak differently to people in the city center. And that is completely normal because we establish ways of communication, you know, according to most of the time people around us, our immediate realities. So anyway, that was a rant. A standard form of any language is the one that's codified. It's the one that is taught in schools, grammar books, and dictionaries, okay? Doesn't mean that it's the most prestigious, superior way of speaking. And also important, and you should like repeat this in your mind, the standard form of a language is not the language. Okay? So there's a tendency for people to say that what is in the dictionary is the language. What's in the dictionary is what's in this, is what it's Spanish, right? But there are different varieties and there's different dialects. So the most important definition that you could learn in a linguistics class is that when we talk about a standard form of any language, we're talking about a dialect. So standard English, standard Spanish, standard whatever is a dialect that was made for educational purposes and business purposes and science purposes. It's a formal dialect. Why formal? Because it's used in formal settings. So in interviews, in law, in writing, right? So in high stakes situations. Yeah, in the United States, they have their own slang. Yeah, exactly. But we could talk more about that later. So yeah, so standard anything is a dialect. It's not the language. That's why you should be careful when you use words like incorrect and correct, because what is incorrect and correct is an ideology. Okay, it's an idea, and that idea is based on a dialect developed in school, in academia, by educators, okay? But nobody is brought up from birth speaking standard anything. Standard is taught in school, so you become exposed to a standard form of anything. The moment that you receive education, you learn the writing system, you become literate. But all ways of, like all languages have variation and have many dialects. The standard dialect is just one of those dialects. And that's really important as a definition. So the study of standard grammar can be seen as a recipe book, right? You have the dictionary or you have your language book. So it's a recipe book or rule-based system for understanding the uses and functions of its ingredients, which are the words, and how these combine to make the end product, a sentence, right? But we know that a sentence, we can detect it visually, no problem. But when we're talking about a sentence in connected speech, in spoken natural speech, it's difficult to discern when to put a period or a comma, whatever, you know, those kind of things. So a sentence in spoken language is kind of a little bit irrelevant, and we typically see the end of an idea being communicated as maybe the end of a sentence in spoken language. So knowledge of grammar is knowing how to put words and ideas together effectively to communicate information. Okay, that's why standard grammar is not the only grammar that has rules, but that African American English, Latino English, California English, Boston English, New York City English, Southern English, all these different Englishes, youth Englishes, so the English spoken by the youth, they all have rules. Why do they all have rules? Because people understand each other at the end of the day. So knowledge of any grammar is knowledge of knowing how to put these words together to communicate effectively. And standard grammar has a set of rules, and other grammars also have sets of rules. It just so happens that standard grammar has dictionaries dedicated to it. So English grammar and why it's important. This class is about the grammatical system of the English language, but specifically standard English. Why? because you're not linguistic majors, so you don't really need to know about other Englishes. And for our purposes, and for you, it'll be useful for you to learn about standard English because you are in academia, you are an undergrad at a bilingual institution. So that means that some of your textbooks are written in standard English. So that's why we're focusing on standard English grammar. Why study English? Well, as we said before, English is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. There are roughly around 400 million native speakers of English. Nobody's trying to join this class, right? Right. Oh wait, somebody's trying. So there are roughly around 400 native speakers of English. English is the most spoken second language in the world. Okay, so yes, there are a lot of speakers of English in the world, but we could also say, that Spanish is a global language, and indeed, Spanish has more first language speakers than English. And in number one position, we actually have Mandarin Chinese. So most people speak Chinese in the world as a first language, right? But nevertheless, English is still a global language in terms of how many people speak it as a first language. And if we were to include the amount of second language speakers, it would surpass Spanish and Mandarin Chinese, okay? So the most spoken second language in the world today is English. So that's probably especially why we shouldn't say that US standard English is the one true correct way to speak English, or that UK standard English is the one true correct way. Why? Because most of the speakers of English in the world don't speak English as a first language. They speak it as a second language. So there are a lot of world Englishes. So it's really problematic to say that US English and UK English are the superior ones, especially when there's so many people in other parts of the world that are using English on their day-to-day lives as a second language, third language, or for their jobs. And it's a crucial part of their identity and their, who they are. So anyway, but let's continue. So who speaks English in the world? Well, we know Great Britain and Northern Ireland, right? The UK collectively. Former colonies of the United Kingdom, so United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Republic of Ireland, India, African countries, Caribbean islands, and other South Asian countries. Other countries speak it as a second language due to the influence of American culture, or, if we're talking about Europe, British culture as well. English has an unquestionable global influence. We see it in the sciences, in the journal articles and textbooks and other publications. We see it in the tech industry. So programming languages like Python, etc., are based on English syntax and grammar. We see it in businesses, so like the language of marketing and advertisements. We see it in entertainment and the media industry, especially now with these streaming websites becoming so popular, and we're turning to them in our pandemic to keep us sane, right? So we're exposed to English more and more every day. And in higher education as well, we're exposed to standard English. So as we said before, there are many different dialects of English, but this class will focus on a formal dialect, which is standard English grammar. So standard English. And I say here that standard English is an ideology. Why an ideology? Sorry, because it was constructed, right? A set of rules constructed as representative, or, as representative enough for that language, but it doesn't mean that it covers the entirety of that language. Okay, so it's an ideology. And also, let's complicate it a little bit more. This is kind of like my background coming in. When people write grammar books and establish the rules of what is correct or what is incorrect or what is part of our standard, you have to think about the background of the people that are making these decisions. So like, are these people male? Are they female? What's their socioeconomic background? Like, were they brought up in elite settings? Did they have all these opportunities brought to them? And did they interact with people who are, you know, from other socioeconomic backgrounds that are perhaps not as elitist or prestigious? So are they factoring in the reality of how language is used right now, or their ideas of how it should be used, right? And if we're talking about English, standard English, the problem and the issue here, a big one, is who is the speaker of standard English historically, right? So who is it based on? And if you go deep enough and you study the history of English in the United States and standardization processes and dictionaries and whatever, you find that it's the white American European male. Okay, so standard English doesn't include the English spoken by other Americans, like Native Americans or African Americans or Latinos that lived in America, you know? So it doesn't include all these other groups. It includes a specific group, okay? So there's some issues of power here. So that's another rant. But again, you have to keep in mind that my area is language and society. So I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna give it to you like it is, okay? I'm not gonna hide this. I'm not gonna hide the ugliness behind some of these terms. So what do I mean by formal language? So when we talk about formal language, although a problematic label due to the many legitimate varieties and dialects of English, standard English can be defined as a universal set of rules or regularities found in the structure of different Englishes, right? So it's ideally the universal set of rules, ideally. It should cover the regularities of different Englishes. It doesn't cover everything. It leaves out groups, okay? But, you know, that's what it is ideally. Standard English is best defined in terms of its internal structure and not pronunciation. And this is also an important definition. So when we talk about grammar or standard English grammar or saying things correctly or incorrectly, whatever, we're talking about the internal components. We're talking about the words, the components of these words, the components of a sentence. But we never talk about pronunciation, because if the internal structure varies according to ethnic group, which it could, pronunciation is even more variable. It depends on gender. It depends on the languages that you know. It depends on the shape of your vocal tract, right? It depends on like biological things. So it's impossible to talk about standard and focus on one way of saying things, pronouncing things correctly. So when we talk about standard English, the best definition is structure and not pronunciation, because everybody has an accent, everybody, okay? So standard English, we talk about it with grammar and syntax, morphology, and semantics. Semantics is the study of the meaning of words in a sentence. All right, so I have 4 minutes, so we'll stop at 9:20, so I'll continue. So what is standard English? So Carter McCarthy O'Keefe defines standard English as a variety of language that is used by the government, so a powerful institution. The media, super powerful, right? Because the people that we see there tend to be, you know, from prestigious backgrounds. The language that is used in schools and for international communication. Those are the different domains and the different places where we could see standard English. There are different types of standard Englishes in the world, not just US standard English or North American English, but we could also have Australian English, Indian English, etc. Schools or academe are the main promoters and producers of the knowledge of what is standard English. This idea is fine. Now, when could it go wrong? It could go wrong in the event that somebody doesn't receive the same quality of education or has access to the same quality of education as someone else. So that means that some people may be able to acquire standard English grammar more than others because of their social circumstances that are favorable to this. Okay, so there's a lot of inequality in terms of access to standard English, which is also socially problematic because a lot of the times language shows to the world a part of who you are, and people judge you by the way that you speak. So in situations when you want to apply for a job or, you know, move up the socioeconomic ladder or get a desired position, people will judge you not just by your background and how you look, but how you talk. So it could be a problem, the fact that, you know, it's mostly found in schools and people hold it up high as the one true correct way. And also sometimes people will judge someone else's intelligence on the basis of whether they know how to speak the standard or not, which is also quite, you know, unfair because somebody could be legitimately an intelligent person, but just not, you know, have that competence in a standard language. So in the United States, when we talk about standard English, different ways of talking about it is calling it North American English, standard US English, or US broadcaster English. Broadcaster means the television news, okay? And in the UK, when we talk about standard English, we call it BBC English. And that's just a video of a linguist talking about standard English from a sound perspective. You don't have to see that. We'll skip that. So from a linguistic definition, what is grammar? It deals with the form of sentences and the smaller units that make up these sentences. So throughout this class, we've been giving different definitions of what is grammar, what is standard English grammar, why is it problematic to define, whatever, right? But for the purposes of this class, which focuses on formal standard English, all you need to know is it deals with the form of sentences and the smaller units that make up these sentences, and that is the most simple definition, superficial, okay? So what are the smaller units that make up a sentence? Well, smaller units that make up a sentence can be a clause. A clause is made up of a subject and a predicate. It could be a phrase, and we'll talk about phrases in the future. A sentence can have words, so like a noun, a verb, adjective, adverb, etc. Okay? So for Friday on Canvas, answer this. Check the statements which are true. All right, and I'll have a copy of this on Canvas as well, but Make sure that you answer this for Friday, okay? It's based on today's class. And we'll end here, okay? Thank you for joining me. Are you there? Okay, have a good day.
Yes.